Aaron Rodgers has yet to make a decision about where he's going to play in 2023. Quincy Williams, however, has decided to return to the Jets. We're talking the beginning of the offseason today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, March 13th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Well, Monday is the unofficial beginning of the NFL offseason. The quote-unquote legal tampering period begins Monday at noon Eastern. The official beginning of the offseason is this coming Wednesday. That's the beginning of the new league year. And that's when moves officially can be filed with the league. So that's when, teams can negotiate trades in January, February, early March, but they cannot be officially executed until Wednesday. And the same is true of free agent signings. Free agents cannot technically sign with a new team until Wednesday. However, what's known as the legal tampering period begins on Monday. Now, tampering is when you talk about a contract with a player who's under contract for another team. So a lot of guys whose contracts are about to expire, they're still technically under contract until the beginning of the new league year. But what the NFL does is they allow guys who are about to become free agents to begin discussing negotiating with other teams 2 days before the start of free agency. So it's tampering, but it's legal. And this is now the 11th year of the legal tampering period. Why did it come into existence? Well, the NFL found that teams were tampering with players before the beginning of free agency, so the league decided we'll just make it legal. Now, if you think this through, it's not really a decision that makes a whole lot of sense, because what incentives do you think the NFL is sending by creating a rule like this, the legal tampering period? Essentially, the league is saying, okay, these teams were breaking our rules, so instead of enforcing our rules, we're just going to allow them to break our rules. What do you think teams' response is to that? Do you think that they are now more or less likely to tamper with other teams' players before the beginning of the legal tampering period? I would say more, because the NFL has shown that they will not punish teams for tampering. So, in the weeks leading up to the legal tampering period, I'm sure there was all sorts of illegal discussion between teams and players, and inevitably every single year, the legal tampering period begins at noon. At like 12:05, a new contract is announced. A big contract is announced for some big name player. I don't think they necessarily. I tended to doubt that they worked out the parameters of a deal within 5 minutes. I think that what probably happened was there was some illegal tampering going on. But because this is the unofficial beginning of the NFL offseason, and the other thing with the legal tampering period is that theoretically players and teams are not supposed to they're not supposed to agree to contracts. They're just supposed to begin negotiating, begin discussing. Now, of course, the problem with that is once you begin negotiating, you can easily reach a deal. And the NFL, again, doesn't enforce this rule because it's an unenforceable rule. But all this means is that while the official beginning of free agency might be Wednesday, it's really today. And that's why it's important for the Jets to find out about what's going on with Aaron Rodgers today, because as of the recording of this podcast, and that could change. One of the challenges of podcasting at this time of year is that the information I give you could be obsolete by the time you listen to it. It could be obsolete 5 minutes after I post it. But as of the time where we are recording this, Aaron Rodgers has still not made a decision on what he wants to do in the 2023 season. Now, one thing I have been frequently this offseason is wrong. I have been wrong pretty much every step of the way. I've expressed skepticism that the Jets would be able to get Rodgers. I expressed skepticism with the Nathaniel Hackett hire from the standpoint that it seemed to me like a big part of the calculus was that the Jets were trying to convince Aaron Rodgers to come by hiring a coach he has very close ties with, Nathaniel Hackett. And the point that I made was Denver tried this last year and it did not work. So why is it going to work for the Jets? Well, I may be very wrong. You may look back on the January, February, early March editions of the Locked On Jets podcast as not my finest hour, because I think at this point it does seem likely that it's going to happen because it seems like the Jets are really the only team that wants Aaron Rodgers right now. Even the Packers, the Packers have said they'll take him back if he decides to return, but they do not seem that convincing about that. And there's always the possibility, especially at this time of year, that a surprise team could come in. There could be a team we're not expecting to start bidding on Rodgers. But at the moment, it seems like the Jets are the only team that's really in on Rodgers. And not only that, so if Rodgers wants to continue playing, the Jets might be his only option. And if you're Rodgers, you got a $60 million, that's $60 million contract for this season. He will be the highest paid player in the league. I don't know that Rodgers is going to walk away from $60 million. And beyond that, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the Jets, I don't want to be derogatory and use the word desperate, but they're kind of desperate to get Aaron Rodgers. And I think, you would have to assume that they're going to give Rodgers whatever he wants. I think if the Jets get Rodgers, it could be like one of those situations where an NBA team gets a superstar, and the superstar is really the GM of the team. I think lots of, all of Rodgers' friends are going to be signed. The Jets are clearly going to go all in because when you trade for a 40-year-old quarterback with a $60 million contract, winning the Super Bowl becomes an imperative. So the Jets will go all in. They'll bring in veterans. They'll bring in guys with close ties to Rodgers. So, if you're Rodgers, do you want to walk away from $60 million and a team that will pretty much give you everything you ask for? And that, it goes beyond the players that they'll sign. I mean, I think any request Rodgers has will be accepted by the Jets. This is to say that I feel like it's probably going to happen if I had to guess. And that's not something I was saying, maybe 2 weeks ago. It's not something I was saying 2 months ago. And 2 months ago, I was expressing a lot of skepticism. And it seems like every step of the way, I've misread this situation. So who knows? Maybe I'm wrong about this too. But I do think the Jets, the sooner they get an answer, the better. Because, again, free agency is beginning right now. And normally what happens is when we're talking about any given position, the top player on the market is usually the first domino to fall. Because there are usually a lot of teams interested in that player. And, the second best player and third best player, they're waiting for the top guy to go because the top guy kind of sets the market. And then once the top guy goes, the second best guy becomes the most coveted guy, so he eventually has multiple guys bidding on him. In the case of Rodgers, the Jets are really the only team that's interested. So I don't know that Rodgers is necessarily going to freeze the quarterback market. So when you talk about your fallback plans, your Jimmy Garoppolos, your Jacoby Brissett's, which are not really particularly great options, they're not going to wait for Rodgers because the Jets are the only team in on him. It's not like the teams that are interested in Garoppolo and Brissett right now are in on Rodgers as well. Again, that could change, but essentially, if the Jets don't get an answer from Aaron Rodgers, their backup plans may go off the board. And this has already happened because the number one backup plan was Derek Carr, and he went off the board because the Jets are pursuing Rodgers. So the longer this thing goes on, the more difficult it is for the Jets. But Rodgers also does know this. I mean, I think Rodgers clearly knows that the Jets need an answer. So my guess is that it's going to happen at some point. And the other possibility here is that there's all sorts of different rumors. I'm not even going to guess which rumors are true, but there's also the possibility that this thing's already done and they just haven't announced it yet, and Rodgers wants to do it to maximize attention or something. So that's the other possibility to consider here. So ultimately, though, I do think that the sooner the Jets get an answer, the better. And I think the longer this drags on, the more difficult it is. Now, if the Jets don't have an answer by noon on Monday, it's not the end of the world. If the Jets don't have an answer by 3 o'clock Monday, it's not the end of the world. It may not even be the end of the world if we don't have an answer, by Tuesday. But the longer this thing drags on, the more difficult it is for the Jets. So, it becomes progressively a little bit more difficult the longer this drags on. So, you'd like to see Rodgers, if you're the Jets, come up with an answer for you as soon as possible, but ideally sometime early this week so that you can move on, so that you can have certainty. Because if you don't get Rodgers, you have to move on to plan B. Not only does that mean you sign the quarterback, but the quarterback's going to be less expensive than Rodgers. Now, maybe not cap-wise, but if you're getting another quarterback, you're going to have to fill in more of the team around him because whatever quarterback he gets is not going to be able to carry as big of a load as Aaron Rodgers. So I think your offseason plan will adjust accordingly. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about another aspect of the Jets' offseason plan. Robert Saleh told us last week that they wanted to bring back the same defense, and they took a big step toward that by re-signing Quincy Williams on Sunday. Let's talk about the Quincy Williams contract as we continue this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. We are approaching the NFL offseason. Joe Douglas is going to be hard at work. Have you ever thought about putting yourself in Joe Douglas's shoes? Well, then you should try the game Ultimate Football GM. In fact, you've heard me talk about this mobile app, and if you thought you'd make a good GM, you've got to give this game a try. It's not as easy as you might think to create a dynasty, because when you play Ultimate Football GM, you get to control and manage every strategic aspect of your team as you play through seasons and lead your team to glory trying to build a historic dynasty. With Ultimate Football GM, you are responsible for controlling the destiny of your franchise by hiring the right coaches and coordinators, managing all the finances, including negotiating player salaries and terms, and navigating your franchise through free agency, the draft, injuries, player personnel issues, and all the ups and downs of the season. And all of this happens in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline, so you can play as the go as you want to and when you want to. And Locked On Jets listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code LOCKEDON, all caps, in the game store. Again, that's Locked On in all caps, so to be sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. Again, that's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms. The legal tampering period begins on Monday. That's when the Jets and other teams can begin talking with other teams' free agents, but we still are in an area where teams are allowed to negotiate exclusively with their own players who are about to become free agents, and the Jets prevented one of their own from hitting the market because they reached a deal with linebacker Quincy Williams on Sunday on a 3-year contract worth $18 million. It maxes out. He could get $21 million with incentives, $9 million guaranteed, according to reports. If you've been a listener to the show over the last couple months, you know I'm not the biggest Quincy Williams fan in the world. It's not that I think he's an awful player. I think maybe he's a little bit overhyped, and I think maybe the Jets like him a little bit too much. You know, I think he's a player he has his moments, but he's also flawed. And I have to tell you, like, I was gearing up for this one because I felt like the Jets were going to re-sign him. I felt like it was going to be a deal that was way too much money. I was really gearing up to, like, really get into, criticize the Jets. But I can't because, to be honest with you, the money on this is pretty reasonable. And I did a podcast a few weeks ago where I expressed fear that we'd be talking an 8-figure deal, maybe $10 million or more a year for Quincy Williams. This just is the type of guy who he makes splash plays. He's inconsistent, but he makes splash plays. You can see the speed on film. This is the type of guy who gets overpaid in free agency. But I don't think the Jets overpaid here. I mean, it's $6 million a year. I think it's a reasonable deal for a linebacker. I would like to see the Jets upgrade their linebacker group, but I find it, I think it's maybe kind of a philosophical thing with Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh. Maybe they just don't believe in investing, big resources at the linebacker position. So if Quincy Williams is the type of guy, I feel like if he's like your 8th or 9th best player on defense, you're doing pretty well. You're doing pretty good. I think he fits the Robert Saleh mentality. Saleh has that expression, all gas, no brakes. Well, Quincy Williams certainly is a guy whose game models that mantra because he plays with a lot of speed. He plays with a lot of aggression. In fact, I think he plays with too much aggression at times. I think there are moments where he runs himself out of the play. I think that there are moments where he fills the wrong gap because he's playing too aggressively. So you see the big hits. You see him. I mean, he could deliver a big hit. But part of the reason he could do that is because he plays so aggressively, and sometimes that aggression is used against him. He's not a great cover guy. Again, he's inconsistent. But at $6 million, he's not being paid to be a premium player. He's being paid to kind of be what he was last year. A guy who's more of a somebody who prevents the linebacker position from being a total disaster. He's a guy who, keeps the linebacker position credible, or at least borderline credible. And again, for $6 million at the linebacker position, that's not a bad deal. I really can't complain. As much as I wanted to complain about this, and I was really gearing up to be upset with the Jets because I figured they would give him a deal for much more. I can't complain about it. As much as like my plan A was to upgrade at linebacker and maybe improve on Quincy Williams, I think this deal just seems reasonable to me. And of course, the other factor to this is Quinnen Williams. Quincy Williams and Quinnen Williams are brothers. Quinnen Williams, of course, is searching for a new contract from the Jets. Do I think that his brother being around is going to change everything? Do I think he's now going to take a huge hometown discount to stay? No, I do not. It is ultimately a business. Quincy and Quinnen actually began their careers on different teams. The Jets drafted Quinnen. The Jaguars drafted Quincy, and the Jets only got Quincy Williams because the Jaguars waived him and the Jets picked him up. So do these brothers need to be on the same team? No. But is it the type of thing that can maybe help the Jets out a little bit in their recruiting, the fact that his brother's on the team? Of course it is. You would think, at least. So from that standpoint, I think, another area where it's maybe a move that has a resonance beyond just re-signing one of your own players. I think that this defense, I understand why the Jets want to run it back with this defense. And look, this defense was good because of the defensive line and because of corner. So essentially, I think what the Jets are viewing this as is they want to prevent their linebacker position from getting weaker. And if they can bring back the same linebacker group, they're confident in what they have on the defensive line. They're confident in what they have at corner. And, maybe the safety is the spot they're looking to upgrade after they traded for Chuck Clark. So right now we have two moves in the book this offseason. They have the trade for Clark and the signing of Williams. Not big ticket moves by any stretch of the imagination, both on the defensive side of the ball, both in areas that are among the weaker spots on a very good defense. I think of both moves. I approve of both moves. I don't think either of them is a game-changing move, but I'm surprising myself because I did not think that we'd be in a situation where I'd be pleased with the deal the Jets gave Quincy Williams, but I think ultimately this was not what I was expecting. So again, we look through the early stages of this offseason. You could probably just disregard anything I said in January, February, early March, because all of my predictions have been wrong to this point. We'll see whether that continues. Quincy Williams returns to the Jets. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will close out our show. The Jets made a couple other housekeeping moves over the weekend. We'll discuss some of the restructures. We'll discuss a restricted free agent tender for Bryce Huff. That's as we continue this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Of course, we're in the NFL offseason, but the NBA is gearing up for the playoffs as teams are trying to make their runs to the postseason. And now it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000, and that's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers, even threes drained. Plus, FanDuel lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss a chance to get to your no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday, heading into the offseason. Monday is the unofficial first day of the offseason, and to get ready for it over the weekend, the Jets restructured some contracts. 3 players, DJ Reed, Tyler Conklin, and Laken Tomlinson, restructured their deals. It creates about $15 million of cap space, which perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not coincidentally, would be the cap hit for Aaron Rodgers' first season with the Jets if the Jets and Packers make a deal. So kind of ironic. Maybe not such a coincidence. Maybe the Jets clearing out the cap space for Aaron Rodgers, or it could just be that they're clearing out the cap space for other players. But three Jets restructured their deals to create about $15 million in cap space. Of the 3, I mean, DJ Reed's the one that is really the one that's not a big deal at all, because if you know a guy's going to be with you for multiple seasons, restructuring the deal just doesn't really matter that much. Where restructures get you into trouble sometimes is they get you into trouble with guys you don't want to keep, because essentially what you're doing with restructuring is you're creating short-term cap space now. You're lowering a player's cap hit for 2023, and you're increasing it in future seasons, and that increase is non-refundable. It becomes guaranteed. It becomes part of that player's cap hit in the future, and it increases the amount of what's known as dead money that it takes to cut a player. And dead money is essentially when you cut a player, all money that you paid to him that has not yet been charged to your cap, that's charged to your cap immediately. So dead money is essentially the cap space a player takes up who's no longer on your team. With Tomlinson and Conklin, it's a little bit riskier. It's not. I don't think it's super risky, but it is a little bit riskier, especially with Tomlinson, because he was very up and down this past season, and he's an older player. So I think with Tomlinson, it's a little bit riskier. Conklin, if you're a longtime listener, I'm not a big fan of Tyler Conklin, but the Jets' opinion on him seems to be very different from my opinion. So I would fully expect Conklin to be on the team past 2023. And ultimately, what the Jets are doing, I mean, it seems like they're really gearing up, and you can see the plan coming into place where they're looking to make a move for Aaron Rodgers, but even beyond making a move for Aaron Rodgers, once you get Aaron Rodgers, you got a 1 to 2 year window with him, and you got to maximize that window. So Jets are pretty much. I think the Jets are going. You're going to see more restructures. You're going to see the Jets move more money around. You're going to see the Jets try and lower as many 2023 cap hits as possible, even if it means these players get more money in the future, because they want to just load this team up with talent around Aaron Rodgers, and they want to try and make a Super Bowl run. And of course, that's contingent on getting Aaron Rodgers, but that's the plan right now, and you can clearly see that coming into vision. And one final move the Jets made, they gave Bryce Huff what's known as a second round tender. And so Bryce Huff's a restricted free agent. So what that means is that the Jets offer him a 1-year contract. And once the Jets offer him a 1-year contract, Huff is free to seek offers from other teams. But if he signs a contract with another team, it's known as an offer sheet for restricted free agents. The Jets have the option to match that deal. And if the Jets match that deal, Huff returns to the Jets on that contract. If the Jets choose not to match that deal, the Jets could be entitled to draft pick compensation, depending on how much the 1-year contract the Jets offered Huff is worth. So the Jets gave Huff what's known as a second round tender. So that means that it's a high enough contract on 1-year deal for Huff. The offer to Huff is high enough that if the Huff signs with another team and the Jets choose not to match the deal, the Jets get a second round pick from that team. And I think that's a pretty logical move. Bryce Huff's a good player, a very good player. And the Jets, I think a second round pick will probably scare a lot of teams off from adding Bryce Huff. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're listening on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the Locked On Jets podcast. Have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk about what the Jets did on day 1 of free agency.